I want to discuss the subject of dehumanization, something I have been thinking about ever since a man took the lives of 3 wonderful souls from my Muslim community back home in North Carolina in February of 2015. It happened in Chapel Hill, the same town my brother was living in while attending college. Our friends, Diet Barakat, his wife, Yusr Abu Salha, and Yusr's sister Razan were shot execution style in Diet and Yusr's home. Razan had been visiting them at the time. We refer to them as our 3 winners because honestly, they were the best of our community and they had lived their lives to the fullest. When we held a vigil for them, we were all crying. If we hadn't known them personally, we knew someone who knew them. Up until then, we had all believed in a myth, the myth that we could protect ourselves from being murdered or otherwise assaulted if we just lived our best, most American Muslim lives. And in fact, we had even thought we could eradicate the problem of Islamophobia ourselves. Of course, there were many problems with this way of thinking, but we willfully ignored it if it meant that there was some way we could guarantee our safety in this world, or feel like we could. So, what exactly do I mean by dehumanization? I'm referring to the view or treatment of others as being inferior or less than fully human. Hate is already such a negative thing, but it is a gateway to dehumanization. And in fact, dehumanization can exist without the hate that would stereotypically be associated with it. It often manifests itself as an unspoken understanding among racist people that not everyone around them should be entitled to the quality of life they have, or to even living in their country. We live in a culture of insanely normalized dehumanization of minorities that has its roots throughout the whole history of the existence of this country, as well as other countries. We think that the genocide of Native Americans or Aboriginals or the enslavement of African Americans and their continuing dehumanization and so on are all dark times that are behind us, but our discrimination against them continues. Our indifference to dehumanization lives on. We say never again, yet we live in a time of multiple genocides. Muslims see this indifference up close every single day, when we are attacked or otherwise threatened by others and no one comes to our defense. I personally have been in these situations many times. I have been spit at, I've been verbally threatened, and even punched in the back of the head while sitting inside a courtroom as a law intern. And no one did anything, let me just emphasize. I'm sorry, but in these cases, you cannot just say that it is a bystander effect. We never think about what our silence or inaction says to others. In the midst of these dark times, I find a light of hope in the desire of people around the world to focus on the victims of this tragedy rather than pay any mind to the terrorists. It gives me so much hope for a better future, but I wonder what the next step is. I worry that efforts in solidarity may end there. I urge us all to take the next step beyond humanizing the victims. When my friends and I were focused on humanizing Diet, Yusr, and Razan, we noticed that we were basically making the case for why our friends' lives should matter to everyone. It made us uncomfortable. And we felt the weight of a bitter truth, that the overwhelming majority of us had not been as accomplished in our lives or as dedicated to charity work as they were. So if terrorism were to claim our lives next, perhaps we would not get the world's sympathy for our executions. We need to ask ourselves how effective it would be to place the responsibility of confronting a dehumanizing culture on the victims of hate crime and terrorism, on dead people, while those who enable a culture that denies their humanity continue to act as though they don't understand why we have to humanize anyone in the first place. Last week's massacres in New Zealand brought the world face to face with the reality that we are not conditioned to treat Muslims as human beings. Consider all of our reactions to Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern's handling of these attacks. I remember watching her speak And it felt as though she were putting her arms around all of us, saying, "Don't worry, I won't gaslight you. This was an act of terror. It was terrorism committed by a terrorist." For the first time ever, we caught a glimpse of what it looks like when a leader actually tries to take responsibility for a hate crime. However, if we are honest with ourselves, her response and her government's response should have been what we expect from leaders as a minimum. It's a sign of how normalized dehumanization has become when consoling victims, calling this attack terrorism when it so obviously is, and announcing that the state will pay for victims' burials and financial compensation are all courageous acts, courageous, extraordinary actions. The reality is, it was the government there that decided to over-surveil Muslim communities and ignore the far right as the terrorists that they actually were. The least they can do is be honest with themselves and help bury the dead. Their government is not alone in this. For some reason, we do not treat the far right as terrorists, despite them fitting the description 100%. In the aftermath of these attacks, I want us to consider what might happen if we took responsibility for a culture in which dehumanization is normalized. I am not suggesting that we apologize for the actions of others, but rather the calling out of hate speech wherever we see it. If we had no tolerance for it, nor for those who enable hate and recognize that free speech does not entail the freedom to engage in hateful speech, maybe something would change. Let us ask ourselves this: can we afford to allow violent hatred to be the new normal, as some are calling it? I think that such a reality means that we have failed to maintain the good in us, the only hope we all ever have to seeing a better world. Let us aim to tackle the roots of terrorism in our everyday lives before we find ourselves violently ripped away from our friends and families. Thank you. Peace be upon you all.